At Blackwater Security Solutions, they thought they'd hired just another desk jockey. Tom Bradley, 34, had applied for a basic administrative position, claiming to be a former office manager looking for steady work. What they didn't know was that the faded eagle tattoo on his forearm belonged to someone who had single-handedly saved an entire platoon behind enemy lines and whose real name was whispered in legend among Special Forces units worldwide. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Tom Bradley arrived at Blackwater Security Solutions on a gray Monday morning in October, carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing an ill-fitting suit that had seen better days. The building itself was an imposing structure of glass and steel in downtown Denver, housing one of the nation's premier private security contractors. To most observers, Tom looked like any other middle-aged man desperate for employment, someone who'd been out of work too long and was willing to take whatever position he could find. His interview had been routine, almost perfunctory. The HR manager, Sandra Mills, had barely glanced up from her computer screen as she reviewed his application. Former office manager at a small logistics company in Ohio that had closed down. Basic computer skills, clean background check. References that checked out but were unremarkable. Nothing in his file suggested anything beyond the ordinary, which was exactly what Tom had intended. The administrative pool at Blackwater was located on the 3rd floor, a sprawling open office space filled with cubicles where civilian contractors handled the endless paperwork that kept military operations running smoothly. Supply requests, personnel files, scheduling, and coordination between field teams and headquarters all flowed through this mundane but essential nerve center. It was the perfect place for someone who wanted to remain invisible while staying close to the world he'd once known. Tom's assigned cubicle was in the far corner, positioned next to a window that offered a view of the parking lot and the mountains. Beyond, he'd requested that specific location during his interview, claiming he worked better with natural light. In reality, the position gave him clear sight lines to all entrances and exits, a habit ingrained by years of training that had kept him alive in places where vigilance meant the difference between coming home and disappearing forever. His immediate supervisor was Janet Chun, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who'd been managing the administrative department for 8 years. She prided herself on running a tight ship, maintaining efficiency, and ensuring that the civilian side of Blackwater's operations supported the field teams without unnecessary complications. To Janet, Tom appeared to be exactly what she needed. Quiet, competent, and unlikely to cause drama. During his first week, Tom established a routine that would define his presence at Blackwater for months to come. He arrived precisely at 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes before his official start time, and used those extra minutes to review the overnight reports from field teams. His work was methodical and thorough, processing supply requests with an accuracy that impressed even Janet's exacting standards. He rarely spoke unless directly addressed, ate lunch at his desk while reading technical manuals, and left exactly at 5 p.m. The other administrative staff initially paid him little attention. Sarah Washington, a recent college graduate who handled personnel files, found him polite but distant. Mike Rodriguez, who coordinated vehicle maintenance and equipment schedules, appreciated Tom's attention to detail, but was put off by his reluctance to engage in office small talk. Linda Foster, the department's unofficial social coordinator, had given up trying to include Tom in after-work gatherings after his polite but firm refusals. It was during his second week that people began to notice small inconsistencies in Tom's carefully constructed persona. When a new employee struggled with the military terminology in field reports, Tom provided explanations with a precision that went beyond what any civilian should know. When a supply request included weapon specifications that seemed incorrect, Tom caught the error and suggested the proper alternative without hesitation. When the building's security system malfunctioned, Tom offered insights into the problem that revealed a deep understanding of surveillance technology. These moments were brief and easily dismissed individually, but they began to accumulate in the minds of his coworkers. Sarah noticed that Tom's posture was unusually straight, his movements economical and purposeful in a way that reminded her of the ex-military personnel who occasionally visited their offices. Mike observed that Tom's handwriting was precise and uniform, each letter formed with the kind of discipline taught in military correspondence courses. Linda saw how Tom's eyes constantly scanned the room during meetings, noting who entered and left, where people positioned themselves, and what conversations were taking place. The faded eagle tattoo on Tom's left forearm became a source of quiet speculation among the administrative staff. Most of the time, it was hidden beneath his long-sleeved shirts, but occasionally, when he rolled up his sleeves to work or reached for files on high shelves, the edge of the design became visible. The artwork was clearly old. The black ink faded to a blue-gray that spoke of years and exposure to harsh conditions. The style was distinctive, featuring an eagle with spread wings, perched atop what appeared to be a mountain peak, surrounded by stars that had blurred with age. During coffee breaks, the staff would sometimes discuss their theories about Tom's background. Sarah thought the tattoo looked military, pointing out the eagle symbolism and the formal style. Mike argued that lots of civilians got patriotic tattoos, especially after events like 9/11's. Linda wondered if it might be related to a motorcycle club or civilian organization that used similar imagery. None of them suspected the truth, that the tattoo was the mark of the 75th Ranger Regiment's most classified unit, a designation that fewer than 50 people had ever earned. Tom's work performance was exemplary in ways that occasionally raised eyebrows among the supervisory staff. When a field team submitted a request for equipment that didn't match their stated mission parameters, Tom flagged the discrepancy and suggested alternatives that would better serve their actual needs. When personnel files indicated potential security risks based on behavioral patterns, Tom identified the concerns with an expertise that seemed to go beyond standard administrative training. When budget allocations didn't align with operational requirements, Tom restructured the proposals with an understanding of field logistics that impressed even the former military officers in management. Janet Chun found herself increasingly curious about her new employee's background. His work was flawless, his attendance perfect, and his discretion absolute. He never gossiped about the classified information that crossed his desk, never asked inappropriate questions about ongoing operations, and never displayed the curiosity that most civilians showed when exposed to the military world. If anything, he seemed more comfortable with classified material than some of their employees who had security clearances. The breakthrough moment came during Tom's 4th week at Blackwater, when a crisis in the field required immediate support from the administrative team. A convoy in Afghanistan had been ambushed, and the field commander was requesting emergency resupply of medical equipment and ammunition. The request came through at 4:45 p.m. on a Friday, 15 minutes before the end of the business day, and required immediate processing to catch the evening transport flight. Janet assigned the emergency request to Tom, knowing his attention to detail would ensure accuracy under pressure. What she didn't expect was the transformation that occurred when Tom realized the gravity of the situation. His casual administrative demeanor vanished, replaced by the focused intensity of someone who understood that lives hung in the balance. He processed the request with military efficiency, cross-referenced the supplies with the convoy's actual needs, identified potential alternatives if the primary items were unavailable, and coordinated with multiple departments to ensure rapid deployment. More telling was his emotional investment in the outcome. Throughout the evening, Tom remained at his desk, monitoring communications from the field and tracking the progress of the resupply mission. When word came that the convoy had successfully received the supplies and casualties had been minimized, Tom's relief was visible and profound. It was the reaction of someone who had been in similar situations, someone who understood the reality of combat operations, someone who had personal experience with the difference that timely support could make. Sarah Washington was working late that same evening and witnessed Tom's intense focus during the emergency. She saw how his hands moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, how his eyes scanned multiple documents simultaneously, and how he coordinated complex logistics without referring to procedural manuals. Most significantly, she noticed how he muttered under his breath in what sounded like military jargon, using terms and abbreviations that she recognized from her work with personnel files, but had never heard from civilian employees. The weekend passed quietly, but when Tom returned to work on Monday, the atmosphere in the administrative department had shifted subtly. His coworkers looked at him with new curiosity, sensing that there was more to their quiet colleague than his carefully maintained facade suggested. Janet Chun made a mental note to review his background check more thoroughly, wondering if important details had been overlooked during the hiring process. Tom, for his part, recognized that his cover was beginning to slip. The emergency situation had triggered responses that he'd thought were buried beneath years of civilian life. The muscle memory of crisis management, the automatic assessment of operational requirements, and the emotional investment in field operations had all surfaced despite his efforts to remain detached. He knew that trained observers would eventually connect the inconsistencies in his behavior with questions about his true background. That Monday also brought a new employee to Blackwater's administrative department. Colonel James Morrison, recently retired from the Army after 25 years of service, had been hired as a senior operations coordinator. Unlike Tom's carefully crafted civilian persona, Morrison's military background was well documented and openly acknowledged. He'd served multiple combat tours, commanded various units, and earned numerous decorations before transitioning to the private sector. Morrison's presence changed the dynamics of the department immediately. His military bearing was unmistakable, his command of tactical terminology was complete, and his understanding of field operations was comprehensive. He moved through the office with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, reviewing procedures and suggesting improvements based on his extensive experience. During Morrison's first week, he worked closely with each administrative team member to understand their roles and responsibilities. When he reached Tom's workstation, the encounter was initially routine. Tom maintained his civilian demeanor, explaining his duties with the same quiet competence he'd shown for weeks. Morrison seemed satisfied with the explanation and moved on to the next employee. But something had caught Morrison's attention. Something that would soon transform Tom Bradley's carefully constructed anonymity into a revelation that would shock everyone at Blackwater Security Solutions. As Morrison walked away from Tom's desk, his trained eyes had caught a glimpse of the faded eagle tattoo when Tom reached for a file. The design, the style, and the placement triggered a memory that made Morrison's blood run cold with recognition. That tattoo wasn't just military insignia. It was the mark of a legend. Colonel Morrison spent the next 3 days quietly observing Tom Bradley with the focused attention of someone who had learned to read people and situations during decades of military service. What he saw confirmed his growing suspicions and deepened his concern about the implications of his discovery. Tom's movements carried the unconscious precision of advanced military training. His situational awareness was far beyond what any civilian would possess, and his handling of classified material suggested familiarity with operational security protocols that were taught only in the most specialized units. The eagle tattoo haunted Morrison's thoughts. He had seen that exact design only once before, in a classified briefing about special operations units that officially didn't exist. The 75th Ranger Regiment's most elite subdivision, known only by the code name Eagle's Talon, had been responsible for missions that senators weren't briefed about and presidents could deny with clear consciences. The unit had been disbanded following a catastrophic operation in Eastern Europe, with all members reportedly killed in action or transferred to other assignments with new identities. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he accessed his secure laptop in his private office, using credentials that allowed him to review personnel files and background checks. Tom Bradley's file was remarkably clean, perhaps too clean for someone his age. The employment history showed a steady progression through various administrative positions, but the references were from small companies that would be difficult to verify thoroughly. His education credentials were appropriate but unremarkable. His financial history showed modest but consistent income, and his address history revealed a pattern of frequent relocations that could indicate either career advancement or something more concerning. What troubled Morrison most was what wasn't in the file. No military service record, despite Tom's obvious familiarity with military procedures. No indication of specialized training, despite his expertise with security protocols. No explanation for his comprehensive knowledge of weapons systems and tactical procedures. The absence of these details wasn't necessarily suspicious in isolation, but combined with the tattoo and Tom's behavioral patterns, it suggested a carefully constructed cover identity. Meanwhile, Tom had become aware of Morrison's increased attention. During his years of covert operations, he had developed an acute sensitivity to surveillance, and Morrison's observation was too focused and too persistent to be casual interest. Tom recognized the signs of a professional intelligence assessment, the lingering glances, the careful positioning to observe his work habits, and the subtle questions about his background during seemingly casual conversations. The tension between the two men created an undercurrent of unease in the administrative department that other employees couldn't identify but definitely felt. Sarah noticed that Morrison seemed unusually interested in Tom's work assignments, often finding reasons to review projects that had already been completed satisfactorily. Mike observed that Morrison asked detailed questions about Tom's handling of equipment requests, probing for insights that went beyond standard supervisory review. Linda saw how both men maintained careful politeness while clearly assessing each other with the wariness of predators recognizing a potential threat. Tom's response to the scrutiny was to intensify his civilian facade while secretly preparing for the possibility that his cover might be compromised. He began varying his routine slightly, taking different routes to work and eating lunch at different times. He started carrying a small emergency kit disguised as everyday items, knowing that if his true identity was discovered, he might need to disappear quickly. Most importantly, he began planning exit strategies that would allow him to leave Denver without triggering a manhunt that could endanger innocent people. The first direct confrontation came on a Thursday morning when Morrison approached Tom's workstation with a supply request that had been flagged for special attention. The document detailed equipment needs for a team operating in hostile territory, including specifications for body armor, communication devices, and medical supplies. Morrison placed the request on Tom's desk and stood watching as Tom reviewed the materials. "This looks like a standard resupply operation," Tom said carefully, maintaining his civilian tone. "The quantities seem appropriate for a 6-man team operating independently for 2 weeks." Morrison's eyes sharpened. "How do you know it's a 6-man team?" "The personnel count isn't specified in the request." Tom felt a chill of recognition. He had automatically calculated the team size based on the equipment ratios, a skill that came from years of planning similar operations. A civilian administrator wouldn't have made that connection, wouldn't have understood the relationships between different types of supplies that revealed operational parameters. "I assumed based on the quantities," Tom replied. But he could see in Morrison's expression that the explanation wasn't convincing. 6 people would need approximately these amounts for a 2-week deployment. That's a very specific assumption, Morrison said quietly. Most people would just process the request without analyzing the operational implications. The conversation ended there, but both men understood that a line had been crossed. Morrison had confirmation that Tom possessed knowledge that contradicted his civilian background, and Tom knew that his cover was seriously compromised. The careful balance that had allowed him to work peacefully at Blackwater was beginning to collapse. That afternoon, Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He contacted an old friend in military intelligence, a career officer who specialized in tracking former special operations personnel. The conversation was brief and conducted in the coded language that former intelligence officers used when discussing sensitive matters over unsecured communications. "I need information about Eagle's Talon survivors," Morrison said without preamble. "Specifically, anyone who might have transitioned to civilian life under a new identity." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Finally, his contact spoke carefully. "That unit is classified beyond my clearance level. What I can tell you is that there were no official survivors of their final operation. What about unofficial survivors?" "Jim, some doors should stay closed. If you've encountered someone who might be connected to Eagle's Talon, my advice is to leave it alone. Those people earned their anonymity through sacrifices that most of us can't imagine." Morrison hung up the phone with more questions than answers, but the conversation had confirmed his suspicions. Tom Bradley was almost certainly a former member of one of the military's most classified units, someone who had been given a new identity after completing missions that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The revelation created a moral dilemma for Morrison. As a former military officer, he understood the importance of operational security and the need to protect classified information. But as a manager at Blackwater, he had responsibilities to his employer and to the security of their operations. The presence of a former special operations soldier in their administrative department could be either a tremendous asset or a significant security risk, depending on the circumstances of Tom's transition to civilian life. Tom, meanwhile, was dealing with his own crisis of conscience. He had chosen civilian life deliberately, wanting to escape the violence and moral ambiguity that had defined his military career. Working at Blackwater allowed him to contribute to military operations without carrying a weapon or making life-and-death decisions. But Morrison's scrutiny was threatening the peaceful existence he had carefully constructed, and he found himself considering options that he had hoped never to use again. The other administrative staff began to notice the tension between Tom and Morrison, though they couldn't understand its source. Sarah saw how Morrison's presence made Tom visibly uncomfortable, despite his efforts to maintain his usual calm demeanor. Mike noticed that Tom had started working longer hours, staying late to complete assignments that he previously finished during regular business hours. Linda observed that both men seemed to be avoiding direct interaction, while remaining hyper-aware of each other's presence in the office. The situation reached a turning point on Friday afternoon when a priority message arrived from one of Blackwater's field teams. The communication was encrypted and required special handling protocols that were beyond the normal administrative procedures. Janet Chun assigned the task to Tom, knowing his reliability with sensitive materials, but Morrison inserted himself into the process, claiming that his security clearance made him the appropriate handler for classified communications. The message detailed an emergency situation involving a Blackwater team that had been compromised during a reconnaissance mission. The team leader was requesting immediate extraction support, including helicopter transport and medical evacuation capabilities. The operation required coordination with military units in the area and adherence to protocols that weren't documented in standard operating procedures. As Tom read the message, his professional instincts took over completely. He began mentally calculating the resources needed for the extraction, identifying potential complications based on the geographical and political situation, and developing contingency plans for various scenarios. His analysis was thorough and sophisticated, drawing on experience with similar operations that a civilian couldn't possibly possess. Morrison watched this transformation with growing certainty about Tom's true background. The way Tom processed the tactical information, the speed with which he identified critical factors, and the depth of his understanding about extraction operations all pointed to extensive field experience. Most telling was Tom's emotional response to the situation, the focused intensity of someone who had been in similar circumstances and understood the stakes involved. "We need to coordinate with the local military commander," Tom said, his voice taking on the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. "The extraction window will be limited and we'll need to ensure air superiority before committing helicopter assets." Morrison leaned forward. "That's a very specific recommendation. What makes you think air superiority will be an issue?" Tom realized too late that he had revealed knowledge that no civilian administrator should possess. His analysis had been based on understanding enemy capabilities and tactical doctrine that came from years of special operations experience. A normal employee would have simply forwarded the message to appropriate military contacts without attempting independent tactical analysis. "I just assumed," Tom said weakly, but the explanation sounded hollow even to him. Morrison made his decision. "Tom, I think we need to have a private conversation. There are things about your background that we need to discuss." The moment had arrived that Tom had been dreading since his first day at Blackwater. His carefully constructed civilian identity was about to be exposed, and he would have to make choices about how much truth to reveal and what consequences he was willing to accept. The peaceful anonymity that had allowed him to contribute to military operations without personal risk was ending, and he would have to decide whether to trust Morrison with the truth or to disappear into a new identity once again. As the workday ended and other employees left for the weekend, Tom and Morrison remained in the office, preparing for a conversation that would determine whether Tom's secret could be preserved or whether his past would once again dictate his future. The faded eagle tattoo on his arm seemed to pulse with significance, a permanent reminder of a life he had tried to leave behind, but could never completely escape. The administrative office fell silent as the last employee gathered their belongings and headed for the elevators. Tom Bradley sat at his desk, methodically organizing his workspace while internally preparing for a confrontation he had hoped would never come. Across the room, Colonel Morrison stood by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the darkening glass as Denver's skyline began to twinkle with evening lights. The weight of unspoken truths hung between them like a physical presence. Morrison turned from the window and walked deliberately toward Tom's cubicle, his military bearing more pronounced now that they were alone. Tom continued his filing, but every muscle in his body was coiled with the tension of someone who had learned to be ready for violence at any moment. Years of civilian life hadn't erased the reflexes that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant death. "The building's security system shows we're the only two people left on this floor," Morrison said, settling into the chair beside Tom's desk. "No recording devices, no surveillance that could compromise what we're about to discuss." Tom looked up from his paperwork, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm not sure what you think we need to discuss, Colonel. If there's an issue with my work performance, perhaps we should schedule a formal meeting with Janet." "Cut the act, Tom, or should I call you by your real name?" Morrison's voice was quiet, but carried the authority of someone accustomed to cutting through deception. "I've spent 3 days confirming what I suspected the moment I saw that tattoo." The mention of the tattoo made Tom's hand unconsciously move toward his left forearm, where the faded eagle design was hidden beneath his shirt sleeve. It was an involuntary gesture that Morrison caught immediately, another confirmation of his assessment. "I have several tattoos," Tom said carefully. "People get them for various reasons. It doesn't necessarily indicate anything significant." Morrison pulled out his smartphone and showed Tom a photograph that made his blood run cold. It was a classified military document displaying the exact eagle design, surrounded by text that identified it as the official insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment's most secretive subdivision. The image quality was poor, clearly photographed from a classified briefing document, but the details were unmistakable. "Eagle's Talon," Morrison said quietly. "Disbanded in 2019 after Operation Nightfall went sideways in Eastern Europe. Officially, all unit members were killed in action or transferred to other assignments. Unofficially, some people believe that a few operatives survived and were given new identities to protect them from retribution." Tom stared at the photograph, feeling the careful walls he had built around his civilian life beginning to crumble. The tattoo had been applied during his final week of training, a permanent mark of belonging to something larger than himself. He had considered having it removed during his transition to civilian life, but the process would have left scars that might have been equally revealing to trained observers. "I don't know what you think that proves," Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Military insignia designs aren't exactly classified information. Anyone could get a tattoo based on something they saw online or in a movie." Morrison shook his head. "The specific design elements in your tattoo aren't available in any public sources. The star configuration, the mountain peak details, the wing positioning, they're all unique to Eagle's Talon. The only people who would know those specifics are unit members or intelligence officers with access to classified materials." The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from Tom's computer, indicating an incoming priority message. Both men turned toward the screen, where an encrypted communication was arriving from the field team they had been supporting earlier. Tom's training made him automatically focus on the message. Despite the personal crisis unfolding around him, the message was brief but urgent. "Extraction compromised. Enemy forces converging on rally point. Request immediate alternative extraction plan. Team leader wounded. Medical evacuation critical." Tom read the message twice, his mind automatically shifting into operational mode. The team was in immediate danger, and their original extraction plan had been compromised. They needed a new plan quickly, one that would account for hostile forces in the area and the additional complication of evacuating a wounded. Team leader. Morrison watched Tom's reaction to the message with professional interest. The transformation was immediate and complete. Tom's civilian facade disappeared, replaced by the focused intensity of someone who had planned and executed similar operations under pressure. His posture straightened, his eyes sharpened, and his hands moved across the keyboard with the efficiency of someone accustomed to working against time. "We need to contact the backup extraction team," Tom said, his voice taking on the clipped authority of someone used to making life-and-death decisions. "The primary rally point is compromised, so we'll need to establish an alternative location that provides cover and allows helicopter access." Morrison leaned forward. "What makes you think you're qualified to make those decisions?" Tom caught himself, realizing how completely he had dropped his civilian cover. But with lives at stake, maintaining his facade seemed less important than ensuring the team's survival. Someone needs to coordinate the response. The field team is requesting immediate assistance. "Yes, but why do you assume you're the person to provide that assistance?" Morrison's question was pointed. "What training or experience gives you the confidence to plan military extraction operations?" Before Tom could answer, another message arrived from the field team. This one included tactical details about enemy positions, terrain features, and operational constraints that would determine the success or failure of any rescue attempt. Tom absorbed the information with the rapid comprehension of someone who had been in similar situations, automatically calculating distances, timing, and resource requirements. The enemy is using the high ground to control the primary extraction route, Tom said, more to himself than to Morrison. But there's a secondary valley approach that would avoid their observation posts. If we can coordinate helicopter insertion with a ground diversion, we might be able to extract the team without direct confrontation. Morrison pulled out a tactical map of the region and spread it across Tom's desk. "Show me." Tom hesitated, knowing that demonstrating his tactical knowledge would confirm Morrison's suspicions about his background. But the lives of the field team took precedence over his personal security. He studied the map for 30 seconds, then began tracing routes with his finger. "Primary enemy positions here and here," Tom indicated, pointing to elevated terrain. "Features: they're controlling this approach route because it's the most obvious helicopter landing zone. But if we insert here," he moved his finger to a different location, "we can use this ridgeline for cover while approaching the team's position." Morrison examined Tom's analysis with growing amazement. The tactical assessment was sophisticated and accurate, incorporating factors that most civilian analysts wouldn't consider. Tom had identified enemy positions based on terrain advantages, calculated helicopter approach routes that would minimize exposure to hostile fire, and developed a coordinated plan that balanced speed with operational security. "How long would the approach take?" Morrison asked. 15 minutes for the helicopter insertion, 20 minutes for the ground team to reach the extraction point, 5 minutes for extraction itself, Tom replied immediately. "Total exposure window of 40 minutes, assuming no unexpected complications." Morrison stared at Tom with newfound respect and concern. The precision of his timing estimates suggested extensive experience with similar operations. No civilian, regardless of their administrative efficiency, could have provided such detailed tactical analysis without specialized training and field experience. "Tom, I need you to understand something," Morrison said quietly. "What you just demonstrated isn't knowledge that comes from watching movies or reading books. You planned that extraction with the expertise of someone who has conducted similar operations under combat conditions." Tom realized that his cover was completely blown. Morrison had maneuvered him into revealing his true capabilities by presenting a situation where his professional instincts overrode his desire for anonymity. The field team's crisis had triggered responses that he couldn't suppress, making it impossible to maintain his civilian facade. "People have different backgrounds," Tom said weakly. "Some people are naturally good at strategic thinking." "Stop," Morrison said firmly. "Just stop. I know who you are, and I know what you've done. The question now is whether we can work together to help that field team while protecting your identity." The directness of Morrison's statement cut through Tom's remaining defenses. He looked at the colonel, seeing not suspicion or threat, but professional respect and a shared understanding of duty. Morrison wasn't trying to expose him for personal gain or bureaucratic advancement. He was offering partnership in service of a mission that transcended their personal situation. "What do you want from me?" Tom asked quietly. "I want you to help me coordinate the extraction of that field team using your expertise," Morrison replied. "And then I want you to trust me enough to explain how someone with your capabilities ended up filing supply reports in an administrative office." Tom considered his options. He could continue denying his background, but Morrison's evidence was overwhelming and his tactical demonstration had been too revealing. He could attempt to disappear, but that would leave the field team without support and might trigger investigations that could expose other former Eagles Talon operatives. Or he could trust Morrison with at least part of the truth and hope that a fellow military officer would understand the need for discretion. "The extraction plan will work," Tom said finally. "But we'll need to coordinate with multiple agencies, and the timing will be critical. Any delay could cost lives." Morrison nodded. I have contacts who can expedite the authorization process. What else do we need? Tom turned back to his computer and began composing a detailed operational plan. His civilian administrator persona vanished completely as he drew on years of specialized training to develop a comprehensive rescue operation. He identified required resources, calculated risk factors, and established contingency protocols with the methodical precision of someone who had planned similar missions when failure meant death for his teammates. We'll need real-time intelligence on enemy movements, Tom said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Weather reports for the extraction zone. Confirmation that our helicopter assets can operate in that terrain. And backup medical support in case the team leader's injuries are more serious than reported. Morrison watched Tom work with growing appreciation for his expertise. The transformation from quiet administrator to tactical planner was complete, revealing capabilities that would have been valuable in any military operation. But questions remained about how Tom had acquired such skills and why he had chosen to hide them in a civilian administrative role. I can get most of that information within an hour, Morrison said. But Tom, after we get this team safely extracted, you and I are going to have a long conversation about your real background. Tom paused in his typing, meeting Morrison's eyes with a directness that had been absent from their previous interactions. Colonel, there are things about my past that can't be discussed, even with someone who has appropriate clearances. Some operations remain classified regardless of time or circumstances. I understand operational security, Morrison replied. But I also understand that someone with your capabilities didn't end up in an administrative role by accident. Something happened that made you choose anonymity over recognition, and I need to know whether that something poses any risk to Blackwater's operations. The field team situation was deteriorating rapidly, requiring immediate action that took precedence over personal revelations. Tom completed his operational plan and transmitted it to the appropriate military contacts, then began monitoring communications from the extraction team. His professional focus was absolute, but Morrison could see the emotional investment that came from understanding the human cost of operational failures. For the next 2 hours, Tom coordinated one of the most complex rescue operations that Blackwater had ever supported, using skills and knowledge that officially didn't exist to save lives that might otherwise have been lost. His civilian cover was completely compromised, but for the first time in years, he was using his training for its intended purpose, bringing his people home safely. The extraction operation unfolded with precision that impressed even Morrison's experienced eye. Tom's coordination was flawless, his communication with field assets crisp and professional, and his real-time adjustments to changing tactical situations demonstrated expertise that could only have been earned through extensive combat experience. As helicopter rotors thundered across the encrypted radio channels and confirmation codes flashed across multiple screens, Morrison watched Tom orchestrate a rescue that would have challenged seasoned military planners. At 9:47 p.m., the final transmission crackled through the secure communication system. Package secured. All personnel accounted for. RTB in 30 minutes. The field team was safe. The wounded team leader was receiving medical attention, and the mission that had seemed impossible just hours earlier was concluding successfully. Tom leaned back in his chair, the tension leaving his shoulders as the immediate crisis passed. For a moment, his guard was completely down, and Morrison could see the emotional toll that the operation had taken. This wasn't the detached professionalism of someone managing logistics from a distance. This was the personal investment of someone who understood exactly what the field team had endured and how close they had come to disaster. Outstanding work, Morrison said quietly. That extraction wouldn't have succeeded without your tactical expertise. Tom turned toward Morrison, and for the first time, his expression was completely open. The careful mask of civilian anonymity was gone. replaced by the direct gaze of someone who had made life-and-death decisions under pressure and lived with the consequences. "Those people have families waiting for them to come home," Tom said simply. "Whatever personal complications this creates for me, getting them safely extracted was worth it." Morrison understood the weight of that statement. Tom had sacrificed his carefully maintained cover to save lives, knowing that his revelation would change everything about his quiet existence at Blackwater. It was the decision of someone whose personal honor superseded self-preservation, a quality that Morrison recognized from his own military experience. "Tom, I need to ask you directly, and I need an honest answer," Morrison said. "Are you former military?" The question hung in the air between them. Tom studied Morrison's face, seeing not accusation or threat, but professional curiosity and perhaps the beginning of respect. The crisis had changed the dynamic between them, transforming suspicion into something approaching partnership. "Yes," Tom said finally, "I am." The simple admission carried enormous weight. With that single word, Tom had confirmed what Morrison suspected and opened a door that could never be closed again. His civilian identity was permanently compromised, and his future at Blackwater would depend on Morrison's discretion and judgment. Morrison nodded slowly. "What unit?" Tom hesitated, knowing that each additional revelation would make it harder to maintain any semblance of his previous anonymity. But Morrison had earned some measure of trust through his professional conduct during the crisis, and complete denial was no longer possible. "Special operations," Tom said carefully. "Beyond that, I can't provide details without compromising operations that may still be classified." The eagle's talon tattoo suggests something more specific then. "General Special Operations," Morrison pressed gently. "That unit has a very particular reputation." Tom's expression hardened slightly. Some reputations are earned through missions that officially never happened. Discussing those missions, even years later, could endanger people who are still serving or compromise operations that remain active. Morrison understood the boundaries that Tom was establishing. Military personnel were bound by oaths and classifications that didn't expire with retirement or discharge. Even former operatives remained subject to security requirements that could have legal and personal consequences if violated. "I'm not asking for classified details," Morrison clarified. "But I need to understand how someone with your capabilities ended up in an administrative role, and whether your presence here poses any security risks for Blackwater." Tom considered how much truth he could safely reveal. Morrison's military background suggested he would understand the complexities of transitioning from classified operations to civilian life, but trust remained a calculated risk. "My unit was disbanded following a mission that went badly," Tom said slowly. "Official casualties were high, and surviving personnel were given the option of new assignments or transition to civilian life. I chose civilian life because I wanted to serve without carrying a weapon or making tactical decisions that would put people in harm's way." Morrison absorbed this information, reading between the lines to understand what Tom wasn't saying. Units like Eagle's Talon weren't disbanded lightly. Their dissolution usually indicated catastrophic failures that required complete operational reorganization and the permanent removal of compromised personnel. And the transition to civilian life, was that supported by official channels? To some extent, Tom replied cautiously. New identity documents, employment placement assistance, periodic check-ins to ensure successful integration. But the support was limited, and the expectation was that former operatives would build independent lives without ongoing government assistance. Morrison began to understand the complexity of Tom's situation. He wasn't simply a veteran seeking civilian employment. He was a former covert operative whose transition to civilian life had been managed by intelligence agencies with their own security concerns and operational requirements. "Does Blackwater's hiring process compromise your security in any way?" Morrison asked. Tom shook his head. The background check was thorough but didn't penetrate the classified aspects of my transition. My current identity is legitimate and supported by appropriate documentation. Working here allows me to contribute to military operations without direct involvement in combat missions. The explanation made sense to Morrison. Former special operations personnel often struggled with complete separation from military culture. Working for a military contractor would provide the familiar environment and sense of purpose that many veterans needed while maintaining the distance from direct combat that Tom apparently desired. "What about tonight's operation?" Morrison asked. "Your tactical expertise was clearly beyond anything a civilian administrator should possess. How do we explain that level of involvement?" Tom had been considering the same question. His demonstration of tactical planning capabilities would be difficult to explain away, and other Blackwater personnel would eventually notice his expanded role in operational planning. "We could frame it as consultation," Tom suggested. "You recognized my administrative efficiency and asked me to provide analytical support for the extraction planning. Most people wouldn't question why a senior operations coordinator would seek input from someone familiar with supply logistics." Morrison considered the cover story. It was plausible but wouldn't withstand detailed scrutiny from security, personnel, or management officials who might investigate the circumstances of the successful extraction. "That might work in the short term," Morrison said. "But your performance tonight was too sophisticated to hide indefinitely. Eventually, people will start asking questions about your background and capabilities." The truth of Morrison's assessment was obvious to both men. Tom's tactical expertise had been too comprehensive and too professional to dismiss as natural talent or lucky intuition. His coordination of the extraction had revealed knowledge and experience that would inevitably attract attention from Blackwater's management and security departments. "I've been expecting this conversation for months," Tom admitted. "My cover was always temporary. I knew that eventually someone would notice inconsistencies in my background or behavior. I just hoped it would last long enough for me to establish a normal life." Morrison understood the longing for normalcy that drove many former special operations personnel. After years of classified missions and constant danger, the appeal of routine work and unremarkable responsibilities was powerful. But Tom's skills were too valuable and too rare to remain hidden indefinitely. "What do you want to happen now?" Morrison asked. "Do you want to maintain your administrative role and hope that no one else notices your capabilities? Or are you open to discussing other possibilities?" Tom knew that his quiet existence at Blackwater was ending. Morrison's discovery meant that his cover was compromised, and the successful extraction operation had demonstrated capabilities that would be difficult to explain away. He faced a choice between attempting to rebuild his anonymity elsewhere or finding a way to integrate his skills into a legitimate role that could satisfy both his desire for meaningful work and his need for security. "What kind of other possibilities?" Tom asked. Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious but hopeful. "Blackwater employs former special operations personnel in various capacities: operations planning, tactical consultation, training development, security assessment. Your skills would be valuable in any of those roles, and your experience would be respected rather than hidden." The offer was tempting, but Tom understood the risks involved. Accepting a role that utilized his special operations background would mean abandoning the anonymity he had worked to establish. It would also mean subjecting himself to enhanced background checks and security reviews that might uncover aspects of his past that he preferred to keep buried. Those positions would require more detailed background investigations, Tom said. "There are aspects of my service record that might complicate such reviews." Morrison nodded, understanding the delicate balance between utilizing Tom's skills and protecting whatever secrets his past contained. "We could structure the transition carefully. Gradual expansion of responsibilities, limited background review focusing on relevant capabilities rather than comprehensive history, emphasis on current performance rather than past operations. The proposal offered a potential path forward that would allow Tom to contribute meaningfully while maintaining some protection for his classified background. But it would also mean permanently abandoning the simple administrative role that had provided him with peace and anonymity. Tom stared out the office window at Denver's glittering skyline, weighing his options. The extraction operation had reminded him of the satisfaction that came from using his skills to save lives and complete important missions. His administrative work was fulfilling in its own way, but it didn't engage the capabilities that had been developed through years of intensive training and dangerous experience. "I need time to consider the implications," Tom said finally. "This decision affects more than just my employment status. It could impact my security, my anonymity, and my ability to maintain the civilian life I've worked to build." Morrison stood up, recognizing that Tom needed space to process the evening's revelations and their potential consequences. "Take the time you need, but understand that your cover is compromised regardless of what you decide. The question now is whether you want to control how your capabilities are revealed or wait for circumstances to force the issue." As Morrison gathered his materials and prepared to leave, Tom remained at his desk, staring at the computer screen that still displayed encrypted messages from the successfully completed extraction operation. The lives saved tonight were real, the gratitude from the field team was genuine, and the satisfaction of using his skills effectively was undeniable. But the cost of that success was the end of his anonymity and the beginning of a new phase of his life that would require careful navigation between his desire for normal existence and the reality of his exceptional capabilities. The faded eagle tattoo on his arm seemed to pulse with significance, a permanent reminder that some aspects of his identity could never be completely hidden or forgotten. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new decisions about how to balance his past with his future, his skills with his security, and his desire for peace with his capacity for excellence. The quiet administrative clerk named Tom Bradley was disappearing, replaced by someone whose true identity remained partially hidden, but whose capabilities were now undeniably revealed. Tom arrived at Blackwater the following Monday morning 30 minutes earlier than usual, using the extra time to prepare for what he knew would be a pivotal day. The weekend had been spent in careful consideration of his options, weighing the risks of exposure against the potential benefits of emerging from his carefully constructed anonymity. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by memories of operations he had hoped to leave behind and visions of a future that remained uncertain and potentially dangerous. The administrative office was empty when he settled at his workstation, but Tom could sense that the familiar rhythms of his quiet existence were about to change permanently. Morrison's discovery had created a fracture in the foundation of his civilian life that couldn't be repaired through denial or deflection. The successful extraction operation had demonstrated capabilities that would be impossible to explain away, and Tom understood that his choices now were limited to different forms of revelation rather than continued concealment. Morrison arrived at precisely 8 a.m., his military punctuality unchanged by the weekend's events. Their eyes met across the office space, and Tom saw recognition and perhaps sympathy in the colonel's expression. Neither man spoke immediately, but the weight of their shared knowledge created an atmosphere of anticipation that seemed to fill the entire department. Sarah Washington was the first of the regular staff to arrive, bringing her usual Monday morning energy and a stack of personnel files that required processing. She greeted both men cheerfully, unaware that the dynamic between them had shifted fundamentally over the weekend. Her casual interaction with Tom carried the same assumptions about his background and capabilities that had characterized their relationship for months, assumptions that were now known to be completely inaccurate. "Tom, I've got some supply requests that came in over the weekend," Sarah said, placing a folder on his desk. Nothing urgent, but a couple of them have some unusual specifications that might need clarification. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Tom accepted the folder with his customary quiet professionalism, but Morrison watched the interaction with new understanding. Every response Tom made, every gesture and expression was now visible as part of a carefully maintained performance designed to conceal capabilities that far exceeded his apparent role. As the morning progressed, other staff members arrived and settled into their familiar routines. Mike Rodriguez brought equipment maintenance schedules that required coordination with multiple departments. Linda Foster distributed updates about policy changes and administrative procedures. Janet Chun reviewed the weekend's communications and assigned priority tasks for the week ahead. All of these interactions proceeded normally on the surface, but Tom felt increasingly disconnected from the civilian persona he had maintained for so long. The breaking point came at 10:30 a.m. when Janet Chun approached Tom's workstation with a complex logistics challenge that had emerged over the weekend. A training exercise scheduled for the following month required coordination between multiple Blackwater teams, military units, and civilian contractors. The operation involved live-fire exercises, helicopter insertions, and simulated hostage rescue scenarios that demanded precise planning and flawless execution. "Tom, I know this is outside your normal responsibilities," Janet said, spreading maps and operational documents across his desk. "But your attention to detail and your analytical skills make you the best person to coordinate the logistics. Can you develop a comprehensive support plan for this exercise?" Tom studied the materials with growing unease. The training scenario was remarkably similar to operations he had planned and executed during his time with Eagle's Talon. The terrain features, tactical objectives, and resource requirements were familiar in ways that would make it difficult to maintain his civilian facade while developing an effective support plan. Morrison observed the interaction from across the office, recognizing the impossible position that Janet had unknowingly created. Tom's expertise would allow him to develop a superior logistical plan, but demonstrating that level of tactical understanding would raise questions about his background that couldn't be answered without compromising his cover. "I'll need some time to review the requirements," Tom said carefully. "This level of coordination involves factors that I'll need to research thoroughly." Janet nodded approvingly. "Take whatever time you need. The exercise isn't scheduled for 6 weeks, so we have adequate preparation time. But the complexity requires someone with your systematic approach." As Janet returned to her office, Tom found himself staring at operational maps that triggered memories he had tried to suppress. The elevation contours reminded him of mountains in Eastern Europe, where his unit had conducted their final mission. The tactical symbols brought back the weight of equipment and the tension of approaching hostile territory. The helicopter landing zones marked on the maps were similar to extraction points where he had waited for rescue that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. Morrison approached Tom's desk with 2 cups of coffee and sat down in the adjacent chair. His presence was casual but deliberate, creating an opportunity for private conversation without attracting attention from other staff members. "That's a complex assignment," Morrison said quietly. "The kind of planning that requires understanding tactical operations from multiple perspectives." Tom accepted the coffee gratefully, using the moment to collect his thoughts. "It's certainly more involved than typical supply coordination. I'll need to research military procedures and coordination protocols." "Or," Morrison said carefully, "you could draw on existing knowledge and experience to develop a plan that would actually work effectively." The suggestion hung between them like a challenge. Morrison was offering Tom the opportunity to use his real capabilities openly, at least within the limited context of their professional relationship. But accepting that offer would mean acknowledging his military background in ways that could have far-reaching consequences. "I'm not sure what you mean," Tom said, maintaining his civilian facade out of habit rather than conviction. Morrison lowered his voice even further. "Tom, I spent the weekend making some discreet inquiries through unofficial channels. I can't get specific details about your service record, but I can confirm that people who know about Eagles Talon speak of that unit with a combination of respect and concern that I've never heard before." Tom felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Morrison's investigation had apparently confirmed his background without revealing specific operational details, creating a situation where his expertise was known, but his secrets remained protected. "What exactly did you learn?" Tom asked. "Enough to understand that your tactical knowledge could make this training exercise significantly more effective and realistic," Morrison replied. "Enough to know that hiding your capabilities is preventing Blackwater from utilizing resources that could save lives in actual operations." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. David Reynolds, Blackwater's Director of Operations, entered the administrative area with the purposeful stride of someone delivering important news. Reynolds was a former Navy SEAL who commanded respect throughout the organization, and his presence in the administrative department was unusual enough to attract attention from the entire staff. "Colonel Morrison," Reynolds said, approaching their workstation. "I understand you coordinated an exceptional extraction operation Friday evening. I'd like to discuss the tactical planning that made that mission successful." Morrison straightened, recognizing that the conversation was moving into territory that could expose Tom's involvement. The operation succeeded due to excellent coordination between multiple agencies and accurate real-time intelligence. Reynolds consulted a tablet computer, reviewing what appeared to be an after-action report. The extraction plan showed sophisticated understanding of terrain analysis, enemy capabilities assessment, and helicopter insertion protocols. The level of tactical expertise exceeded what we typically see from administrative coordination. Tom felt the walls closing in around his secret. Reynolds' investigation had apparently identified the professional quality of the extraction planning, and questions about its source were inevitable. His weekend of careful consideration had apparently been overtaken by events that were forcing revelation faster than he had anticipated. "Administrative staff sometimes develop insights through exposure to operational materials," Morrison said diplomatically. "Analytical skills can be applied effectively, even without direct field experience." Reynolds turned his attention to Tom, studying him with the focused assessment of someone trained to evaluate personnel under pressure. "Mr. Bradley, I understand you provided significant analytical support for the extraction planning. That level of contribution deserves recognition and might indicate potential for expanded responsibilities." The offer of recognition and advancement was exactly what Tom had been trying to avoid. Public acknowledgement of his tactical expertise would inevitably lead to questions about its source, background investigations that could compromise his cover, and scrutiny that could endanger the anonymity he had worked to maintain. "I just provided basic analytical support," Tom said carefully. "Colonel Morrison coordinated the actual operational planning." Reynolds smiled knowingly. "Modesty is admirable, but accurate tactical analysis requires more than basic analytical skills." The extraction plan demonstrated understanding of special operations procedures that suggests relevant background or training. Morrison intervened before Tom could respond. "Sir, Mr. Bradley's analytical contributions were valuable, but the operational planning remained within established protocols and procedures." Reynolds studied both men with growing curiosity. Their defensive responses were clearly intended to deflect attention from Tom's role in the extraction planning, but their evasiveness was actually generating more interest rather than less. "Gentlemen, I'm not conducting an investigation," Reynolds said with slight amusement. "I'm trying to identify talent that might be underutilized in our current organizational structure." If Mr. Bradley has capabilities that could benefit our operations, we should discuss how to utilize those capabilities effectively. Tom realized that his attempts to maintain anonymity were becoming counterproductive. Reynolds's interest was focused on operational effectiveness rather than security concerns, and continued deflection would only increase his curiosity about Tom's background and capabilities. "I appreciate the consideration," Tom said carefully, "but I'm satisfied with my current responsibilities. Administrative work suits my preferences and allows me to contribute without taking on additional stress or complexity." Reynolds raised an eyebrow at the response. Most employees would welcome recognition and opportunities for advancement, especially opportunities that acknowledged exceptional performance. Tom's reluctance to accept expanded responsibilities was unusual enough to reinforce Reynolds's suspicions. About his background, "Mr. Bradley, talent recognition isn't optional at Blackwater," Reynolds said firmly. "If you have capabilities that could enhance our operations, we have an obligation to our clients and our field personnel to utilize those capabilities appropriately." The statement carried an implicit threat that Tom's preferences might not determine his future role at Blackwater. Reynolds had the authority to reassign personnel based on organizational needs, and Tom's demonstration of tactical expertise had apparently triggered interest that couldn't be easily deflected. Morrison recognized the precarious position that Tom faced. Reynolds's determination to utilize his capabilities was creating pressure that could force revelation of his military background, but continued resistance might generate suspicion about his motives for avoiding advancement. "Sir, perhaps we could discuss this matter privately," Morrison suggested. "There may be factors involved that require confidential consideration." Reynolds nodded slowly, understanding that Morrison was indicating complications beyond what could be discussed in the open administrative area. "My office, 30 minutes, both of you." As Reynolds departed, Tom slumped in his chair with the realization that his careful balance between anonymity and contribution was collapsing rapidly. The successful extraction operation had attracted exactly the kind of attention he had been trying to avoid, and his tactical expertise was now being treated as an organizational asset rather than a personal secret. "This is exactly what I was afraid would happen," Tom said quietly. "Recognition leads to questions, questions lead to investigations, and investigations lead to complications that could affect more people than just me." Morrison understood Tom's concerns, but also recognized the opportunities that Reynolds' interest presented. "Tom, your capabilities are too valuable to waste. Instead of fighting recognition, maybe it's time to consider how to manage it safely." The next 30 minutes would determine whether Tom could find a way to acknowledge his skills without compromising his security, or whether his careful transition to civilian life was about to be permanently disrupted by the very competence he had tried to hide. Reynolds' office occupied a corner of Blackwater's executive floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Denver's downtown district and the Rocky Mountains beyond. The space was decorated with military memorabilia that spoke to Reynolds' Navy SEAL background, unit patches, commendation certificates, and photographs from deployments that had shaped his understanding of leadership and operational excellence. Tom felt uncomfortable surrounded by reminders of the military world he had tried to leave behind. Reynolds gestured for both men to take seats across from his mahogany desk, while he reviewed several files that had been prepared for their meeting. Tom noticed that one of the folders bore his name, suggesting that Reynolds had conducted preliminary research into his background and employment history. The sight of his personnel file being scrutinized by senior management confirmed his fears about the growing attention his tactical expertise had attracted. "Gentlemen, let me be direct about why we're here," Reynolds began, closing the files and focusing his attention on Tom. Friday evening's extraction operation was planned and executed with a level of tactical sophistication that exceeded our normal administrative capabilities. The after-action reports indicate that the analytical support provided by Mr. Bradley was instrumental in the mission's success. Tom maintained his composed expression while internally calculating the implications of Reynolds' statement. The after-action reports had apparently identified his contribution specifically, making it impossible to continue deflecting credit to Morrison or claiming minimal involvement in the operational planning. The extraction succeeded because of excellent cooperation between multiple agencies, Tom said carefully. I provided basic analytical support based on the information available. Reynolds consulted his notes with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to evaluating personnel under pressure. The tactical analysis included terrain assessment, enemy capability evaluation, helicopter insertion route planning, and contingency. Protocol development. That level of analytical sophistication suggests training or experience beyond what we typically see from administrative personnel. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Reynolds' assessment was accurate and that continued deflection would only increase his curiosity about Tom's background. The director of operations had clearly invested time in understanding the extraction operation success factors, and his questions were becoming increasingly specific and difficult to evade. Sir, analytical skills can be developed through various experiences, Morrison interjected. Administrative personnel often develop insights through exposure to operational materials and procedures. Reynolds smiled knowingly. Colonel, I've been in this business for 20 years. I can distinguish between analytical insights and operational expertise. Mr. Bradley's contributions demonstrated practical knowledge of special operations procedures that can't be acquired through casual exposure to administrative materials. Tom felt the conversation moving inexorably toward revelations he had hoped to avoid. Reynolds' military background gave him the experience necessary to recognize genuine tactical expertise, and his questions were designed to elicit information that would clarify the source of Tom's capabilities. I've always been interested in military history and tactics, Tom said, offering a partial truth that might satisfy Reynolds' curiosity without revealing his actual background. Reading about historical operations and studying tactical principles can provide insights into effective planning approaches. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, clearly unconvinced by Tom's explanation. Academic study of military tactics might provide theoretical knowledge, but practical application requires experience with real-world constraints and variables. The extraction plan you developed accounted for factors that aren't covered in textbooks or historical analyses. The director's persistence was creating exactly the situation Tom had been trying to avoid. Each question demanded increasingly specific explanations that would either require lies that could be easily disproven or revelations that could compromise his carefully maintained cover identity. Reynolds opened Tom's personnel file and began reviewing its contents aloud. Employment history shows administrative positions with various logistics companies. Education includes a bachelor's degree in business administration. No indication of military service, specialized training, or security clearances. References check out but are remarkably unremarkable for someone with your demonstrated capabilities. Tom recognized that Reynolds was pointing out the inconsistencies between his official background and his proven abilities. The personnel file that had been carefully constructed to support his civilian identity was now working against him by highlighting the absence of experiences that would explain his tactical expertise. Sometimes people develop skills through unexpected experiences, Tom said weakly. Knowing that the explanation sounded inadequate even to him, Reynolds closed the file and fixed Tom with a direct stare. Mr. Bradley, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you have military experience that isn't reflected in your personnel file? The direct question eliminated the possibility of continued evasion. Tom could lie outright, but that would create a false official record that could have legal consequences if discovered. He could refuse to answer, but that would likely trigger a formal investigation that could uncover information he preferred to keep hidden. Or he could provide a truthful response that might allow him to control the extent of revelation while satisfying Reynolds' immediate concerns. Tom glanced at Morrison, seeing encouragement and support in the colonel's expression. Their shared military background created a foundation of mutual understanding that civilian employers might not possess, and Reynolds' own Navy SEAL experience suggested he would comprehend the complexities of transitioning from classified operations to civilian life. "Yes," Tom said quietly. "I have military experience." Reynolds nodded, unsurprised by the admission. "What branch and specialty?" Tom hesitated, knowing that each additional detail would make it more difficult to maintain any semblance of privacy about his background. But Reynolds' questions were reasonable, and his approach was professional rather than adversarial. "Army, Special Operations," Tom replied, providing minimal information while acknowledging the basic facts. "How recent was your service?" Reynolds continued. "I separated from the military approximately 4 years ago," Tom said, maintaining accuracy while avoiding specifics about the circumstances of his transition to civilian life. Reynolds made notes on a legal pad, documenting Tom's responses for what appeared to be an informal record of their conversation. "What was your rank and military occupational specialty?" The questions were becoming increasingly specific, requiring Tom to decide how much truth he was willing to reveal. His actual rank and specialty would provide Reynolds with enough information to conduct detailed background investigations that could uncover aspects of his service record that remained classified. "I held the rank of Sergeant First Class," Tom said, providing accurate information that wouldn't immediately reveal his connection to Eagle's Talon. "My specialty involved logistics and operational planning." The explanation was technically accurate, but deliberately vague. Tom's actual role had involved far more than logistics and planning, but describing his responsibilities in general terms might satisfy Reynolds' immediate questions without triggering deeper investigations. Reynolds studied Tom's responses with the analytical eye of someone trained to evaluate personnel under stress. Sergeant First Class is a senior enlisted rank that typically requires significant experience and demonstrated leadership capabilities. "What types of operations did you support?" Tom felt the conversation moving into territory that would be difficult to navigate without either lying or revealing classified information. His actual operations with Eagle's Talon were far beyond the scope of normal military experience, but admitting that fact would raise questions about his unit assignment and operational background. "I supported various training exercises and deployment operations," Tom said carefully. "Standard military logistics and coordination responsibilities." Morrison recognized that Tom was struggling to provide truthful answers without revealing information that could compromise his security. The questioning was becoming increasingly detailed, and Reynolds' military experience made him capable of detecting evasions and inconsistencies that might escape civilian investigators. "Sir, perhaps we should focus on Mr. Bradley's current capabilities rather than the specific details of his military background," Morrison suggested. "His tactical expertise is clearly valuable regardless of how it was acquired." Reynolds considered Morrison's suggestion, but wasn't ready to abandon his investigation into Tom's background. "Colonel, understanding the source of expertise helps U.S. evaluate its reliability and applicability to our operations. If Mr. Bradley has experience with classified operations, that background could affect his security clearance eligibility and his assignment to sensitive projects." The mention of security clearances and sensitive projects created new concerns for Tom. His transition to civilian life had been designed to avoid exactly the kind of detailed background investigations that clearance applications required. Subjecting himself to enhanced security reviews could uncover connections to Eagle's Talon that might compromise the anonymity that other former unit members were relying on for their protection. I don't currently hold security clearances, Tom said honestly. My civilian employment has been limited to positions that don't require access to classified materials. Reynolds raised an eyebrow at this response. Someone with your apparent capabilities would typically seek positions that utilize those capabilities fully. Why have you limited yourself to administrative roles that don't require clearances? The question struck at the heart of Tom's motivation for seeking anonymity. His desire to avoid clearance investigations, classified assignments, and high-visibility positions was directly related to his need to protect his former identity and maintain the cover that allowed him to live peacefully. I prefer work that doesn't involve the stress and responsibility of classified operations, Tom said, offering a partial truth that might explain his career choices without revealing his security concerns. Reynolds studied Tom's expression with growing understanding. The director had enough experience with former special operations personnel to recognize the signs of someone who had been involved in operations that left lasting psychological or professional impacts. Mr. Bradley, many former special operations personnel struggle with the transition to civilian life, Reynolds said with unexpected empathy. The pace and intensity of classified operations can make normal civilian employment feel unfulfilling or disconnected from meaningful purpose. Tom appreciated Reynolds' attempt to understand his situation, but the director's sympathy was based on assumptions about post-military adjustment, rather than knowledge of the specific security concerns that actually motivated his career choices. I've adjusted well to civilian life, Tom said carefully. Administrative work provides the stability and routine that I was looking for after military service. Reynolds wasn't convinced by Tom's explanation. Yet your performance Friday evening suggests someone who thrives under pressure and excels at complex operational planning. Those capabilities seem wasted in routine administrative roles. The observation was accurate but dangerous. Tom's tactical expertise was indeed being underutilized in his current position, but fully utilizing those capabilities would require acknowledgement of his background that could have consequences extending far beyond his employment at Blackwater. Satisfied with my current responsibilities, Tom insisted. Recognition and advancement aren't necessarily my primary motivations. Reynolds leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. Mr. Bradley, I'm going to be completely frank with you. Your tactical expertise is exactly what Blackwater needs for several upcoming contracts. We have clients requesting operational planning support for complex missions, and your capabilities would be invaluable for those assignments. Tom felt the pressure mounting from multiple directions. Reynolds was offering professional opportunities that would utilize his skills meaningfully, but accepting those opportunities would require submitting to background investigations and security reviews that could compromise his anonymity. Refusing the opportunities would likely trigger questions about his motivations and potentially lead to the same investigations he was trying to avoid. What kind of assignments are you considering? Tom asked, knowing that understanding the scope of Reynolds' proposal would help him evaluate the risks and benefits of different responses. Reynolds consulted another file, revealing documents that were marked with security classifications that made Tom's stomach tighten with recognition. We have contracts for training support, operational planning consultation, and tactical assessment services. All of these assignments would require security clearances and involve classified materials. The mention of classified materials confirmed Tom's fears about the direction Reynolds was taking their conversation. Involvement in classified projects would subject him to exactly the kind of detailed background investigations that his transition to civilian life had been designed to avoid. I appreciate the consideration, Tom said carefully, but I'm not interested in returning to work that involves classified materials or security clearances. Reynolds studied Tom's response with growing curiosity. Most former military personnel would welcome opportunities to utilize their specialized skills in meaningful work, especially work that offered advancement and recognition. Tom's consistent reluctance to accept such opportunities suggested motivations that went beyond normal career preferences. "Is there a specific reason why you want to avoid classified work?" Reynolds asked directly. The question demanded an answer that Tom couldn't provide without revealing information about his transition from Eagle's Talon that would compromise the security of other former unit members. His desire to avoid classified assignments was directly related to protecting secrets that were larger than his individual circumstances. "I prefer the separation between my military service and my civilian career," Tom said, offering the most truthful explanation he could provide without compromising operational security. Reynolds nodded slowly, beginning to understand that Tom's resistance to advancement was motivated by factors that couldn't be easily addressed through normal management approaches. The director's expression suggested growing respect for Tom's position, even if he didn't fully understand the reasons behind it. Reynolds stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out at the mountains. Silence in the office stretched uncomfortably while Tom and Morrison waited for the director's response to Tom's explanation. When Reynolds finally turned back toward them, his expression had shifted from curiosity to something approaching understanding, mixed with concern. "Mr. Bradley, in my experience, people who deliberately avoid utilizing their capabilities usually have compelling reasons for that choice," Reynolds said slowly. "Sometimes those reasons involve personal preferences. Sometimes they involve circumstances that require discretion or protection." Tom felt his pulse quicken at Reynolds' perceptive observation. The director's military background was allowing him to read between the lines of Tom's careful responses, understanding that there were complexities involved that couldn't be discussed openly. "I've simply found that civilian work suits my current life goals," Tom replied, maintaining his diplomatic tone while internally preparing for more probing questions. Reynolds returned to his desk and opened a different file, one that Tom hadn't noticed earlier. The folder was thicker than his personnel file and marked with security classifications that made Tom's breath catch in his throat. Whatever information Reynolds had obtained went far beyond standard employment records. "Tom, I'm going to share something with you that might change our conversation," Reynolds said carefully. "I made some inquiries through unofficial channels over the weekend. Not about your specific service record, but about the general circumstances surrounding certain special operations units that were disbanded in recent years." Morrison leaned forward, recognizing that Reynolds had conducted the same type of background investigation that he had attempted. The director's access to military intelligence networks was probably more extensive than Morrison's, potentially providing information that could compromise Tom's carefully maintained anonymity. "What kind of information?" Tom asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. Reynolds consulted the classified file, reading carefully from notes that had obviously been prepared by intelligence professionals. Several highly classified special operations units were disbanded between 2018 and 2020, following missions that resulted in significant casualties and operational compromises. Surviving personnel from these units were typically given the option of reassignment or transition to civilian life under new identities. Tom's heart sank as he realized that Reynolds had obtained information about the broader context of Eagle's Talon's disbandment. While the director might not have specific details about Tom's unit or his individual service record, he clearly understood the general program that had facilitated Tom's transition to civilian life. The transition process involved creating legitimate civilian identities supported by appropriate documentation and employment placement assistance, Reynolds continued. Former operatives were expected to integrate into civilian life without ongoing government support, but they remained subject to certain security restrictions and monitoring protocols. Morrison watched Tom's reaction to Reynolds' revelations with growing concern. The director had apparently uncovered information that explained Tom's reluctance to pursue advancement while simultaneously creating new pressures and complications for his situation at Blackwater. "Sir, that information sounds highly classified," Morrison said carefully. "Are we authorized to discuss such matters in this context?" Reynolds smiled grimly. "Colonel, my security clearances are current and comprehensive. The information I'm sharing is relevant to personnel decisions that could affect Blackwater's operational capabilities and security posture." Tom understood that Reynolds was demonstrating the extent of his knowledge while offering an opportunity for more honest communication. The director had clearly invested significant effort in understanding Tom's background, and continued evasion would likely be counterproductive. "What exactly are you proposing?" Tom asked, abandoning his attempts to maintain complete denial of his military background. Reynolds closed the classified file and fixed Tom with a direct stare. "I'm proposing that we acknowledge your expertise honestly while respecting whatever security constraints govern your civilian transition. Blackwater has experience working with former special operations personnel who require discretion about their backgrounds." The offer was more reasonable than Tom had expected, but it still involved risks that could affect more people than just himself. Acknowledging his capabilities would inevitably lead to questions about their source, and those questions could potentially compromise the security of other former Eagles Talon operatives who were relying on anonymity for their protection. "What kind of discretion are you talking about?" Tom asked. Reynolds pulled out a different document, one that appeared to be a standard employment contract with several unusual clauses highlighted in yellow. "We have provisions for employees whose backgrounds require special handling, limited background investigations, compartmentalized security reviews, and assignment restrictions that protect sensitive information while utilizing relevant capabilities." Tom studied the contract language, recognizing legal protections that had been designed specifically for personnel in situations similar to his own. Blackwater had apparently developed procedures for employing former covert operatives without compromising their transition to civilian life. "How many other employees have similar arrangements?" Tom asked. "More than you might expect," Reynolds replied. "The private military industry attracts personnel from various classified programs who require careful handling for security and legal reasons. We've learned to balance operational needs with individual protection requirements." Morrison was impressed by Reynolds' approach to Tom's situation. The director had clearly encountered similar circumstances before and had developed policies that could accommodate Tom's needs while utilizing his capabilities effectively. "What specific assignments would be involved?" Tom asked, beginning to consider the possibility that he might be able to contribute meaningfully without compromising his security. Reynolds opened another file containing operational summaries and client requirements. "Training development for special operations techniques, tactical planning consultation for complex missions, and security assessment services for high-risk clients. All of these assignments would utilize your expertise while maintaining appropriate boundaries around classified information." The proposed assignments were appealing in ways that Tom hadn't expected. His administrative work had been satisfying but intellectually limiting, and the opportunity to use his specialized skills for meaningful purposes was tempting despite the potential risks involved. "What about security clearances?" Tom asked. "The work you're describing would typically require access to classified materials." Reynolds had anticipated this concern. "We can structure your assignments to minimize clearance requirements while still utilizing your tactical expertise effectively. Many of our clients need operational planning support that doesn't require access to the most sensitive intelligence information." Tom considered the implications of Reynolds' proposal. The opportunity to contribute more meaningfully to Blackwater's operations was attractive, but accepting the assignment would mean permanently abandoning the complete anonymity he had worked to maintain. I need to understand the long-term implications, Tom said carefully. Once I acknowledge my background formally, there's no returning to complete anonymity. Reynolds nodded with understanding. That's true, but complete anonymity might not be sustainable regardless of your employment decisions. Your tactical expertise is too distinctive to hide indefinitely, and your performance Friday evening has already attracted attention that can't be easily dismissed. The director's assessment was accurate and sobering. Tom's successful coordination of the extraction operation had demonstrated capabilities that would be difficult to explain away, and continued attempts to maintain his cover might actually attract more scrutiny than controlled revelation of his background. Morrison spoke up for the first time in several minutes. Tom, you've already proven that your skills can save lives when they're applied appropriately. Maybe it's time to consider how to use those skills safely rather than hiding them completely. Tom appreciated Morrison's support, but the decision involved factors that went beyond his individual preferences. His transition to civilian life had been part of a broader program that affected other former Eagles Talon operatives, and his choices could potentially impact their security as well. Are there other former Special Operations personnel at Blackwater who might be affected by my decision? Tom asked. Reynolds understood the implication of Tom's question. We maintain strict compartmentalization between employees who require special handling. Your situation would be managed independently without affecting other personnel or their security arrangements. The assurance was helpful but didn't completely address Tom's concerns about the broader implications of acknowledging his background. However, Reynolds' demonstration of knowledge about classified transition programs suggested that Blackwater had experience with the complexities involved and procedures for managing them appropriately. What would be the timeline for implementing such an arrangement? Tom asked. Reynolds consulted his calendar, clearly having anticipated this question. We could begin the transition process immediately. Modified job description, adjusted security protocols, and initial assignment identification could be completed within a week. The rapid timeline was both appealing and concerning. Quick implementation would minimize the period of uncertainty and potential exposure, but it would also limit Tom's ability to carefully consider all the implications of his decision. I need some time to think about this proposal, Tom said finally. The decision affects more than just my career preferences. Reynolds stood up, signaling that the formal part of their meeting was concluding. Take the time you need, but understand that your tactical expertise is already known within the organization. The question now is whether we formalize that knowledge through appropriate channels or continue managing it through informal arrangements. As Tom and Morrison prepared to leave Reynolds' office, the director made one final observation that crystallized the choice Tom faced. Sometimes the best way to protect a secret is to control how it's revealed rather than hoping it remains hidden forever. The comment followed Tom as he returned to his workstation, where the familiar routine of administrative tasks felt increasingly disconnected from his actual capabilities and interests. Reynolds' proposal offered a path forward that could utilize his skills meaningfully while providing protections for his background. But accepting it would mean acknowledging publicly what he had worked for years to keep hidden. Sarah Washington noticed Tom's distracted demeanor when she stopped by his desk with afternoon supply requests. Everything okay? You seem a bit preoccupied today. Tom looked at Sarah's concerned expression, seeing genuine care from someone who had become a friend. Despite knowing nothing about his true background, her friendship was based on his carefully constructed civilian persona, and he wondered how relationships like theirs would change if his real capabilities became known throughout the organization. Just processing some new assignment possibilities, Tom replied honestly. Sometimes career decisions involve more complexity than they initially appear. Sarah smiled encouragingly. Well, whatever you decide, I hope it's something that makes you happy. You've been a great colleague, and you deserve opportunities that recognize your contributions. Her supportive response reminded Tom that acknowledgement of his expertise didn't necessarily mean losing the relationships he had built during his time at Blackwater. People like Sarah valued him as a person rather than just for his professional capabilities, and that foundation might survive the revelation of his true background. As the afternoon progressed, Tom found himself mentally rehearsing different scenarios for his future at Blackwater. He could accept Reynolds's proposal and transition to assignments that utilized his tactical expertise while maintaining appropriate security protections. He could decline the opportunity and attempt to continue in his administrative role, knowing that his cover was compromised and further scrutiny was inevitable. Or he could leave Blackwater entirely and attempt to rebuild his anonymity elsewhere, though Reynolds's investigation suggested that complete concealment might no longer be possible. Each option involved trade-offs between security and fulfillment, between protection and purpose, between the person he had been and the person he was becoming. The decision would shape not only his immediate future, but his long-term prospects. For finding meaningful work that balanced his capabilities with his need for safety and stability, Tom spent the next 3 days in careful consideration of Reynolds's proposal, weighing each option with the methodical precision that had once been essential for survival in hostile territories. His apartment became a planning space where he analyzed the implications of different choices, using techniques learned during mission preparation to evaluate risks, benefits, and potential consequences. The decision felt as critical as any operational choice he had made during his time with Eagle's Talon. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected development that would influence his decision significantly. Janet Chun approached his workstation with unusual urgency, carrying a priority communication that had arrived during the overnight hours. Her expression was serious, and Tom immediately recognized the signs of a developing crisis that would require immediate attention and careful coordination. "Tom, we have a situation that requires your analytical expertise," Janet said, placing an encrypted tablet on his desk. "One of our teams in South America has encountered complications that go beyond normal operational parameters. Reynolds specifically requested your involvement in developing response options." Tom studied the communication with growing concern. The field team had been conducting a routine security assessment for a civilian contractor when they discovered evidence of a larger criminal operation involving weapons trafficking and human smuggling. Their investigation had apparently been detected, and they were now facing threats from organized crime, groups with military-grade equipment and professional training. The tactical situation was complex and dangerous, requiring exactly the kind of specialized knowledge that Tom had been trying to keep hidden. The team needed extraction support, but the criminal organization's capabilities meant that standard procedures would likely result in casualties or mission failure. Developing an effective response would require drawing on his Eagle's Talon experience in ways that would make his background impossible to conceal. Morrison appeared at Tom's workstation within minutes of Janet's departure, clearly having been briefed on the situation by Reynolds. His expression was grim, and Tom could see the weight of command decisions in the colonel's eyes. Lives were at stake, and the normal resources available to Blackwater might not be sufficient to resolve the crisis successfully. "Tom, I won't insult your intelligence by pretending this is a coincidence," Morrison said quietly. "Reynolds deliberately assigned this crisis to test whether you're willing to use your expertise when lives depend on it." Tom understood the strategic nature of Reynolds' decision. The director was creating a situation where Tom's tactical knowledge was essential for mission success, forcing him to choose between maintaining his cover and potentially allowing colleagues to be injured or killed. It was an elegant manipulation that appealed to the sense of duty that had driven Tom throughout his military career. "How much time do we have?" Tom asked, accepting the inevitable reality that he would need to demonstrate his capabilities regardless of the personal consequences. Morrison consulted his watch with military precision. The team has 12 hours before their current safe house becomes untenable. After that, they'll be forced to move without adequate security, and the criminal organization will have multiple opportunities to intercept them. Tom opened the tactical files on the encrypted tablet, immediately absorbing details about terrain, enemy capabilities, available resources, and operational constraints. His mind automatically began developing response options, drawing on years of experience with similar situations where conventional approaches would have resulted in disaster. The criminal organization was well-equipped and professionally trained. With access to military weapons, surveillance technology, and local government corruption that compromised normal law enforcement cooperation. Their territorial control made helicopter extraction dangerous, their intelligence network made ground movement risky, and their financial resources meant they could sustain operations indefinitely. "This isn't a standard extraction scenario," Tom said, his voice taking on the analytical tone that Morrison had learned to recognize. "The enemy has prepared for conventional rescue attempts, and they're using the local infrastructure to their advantage. We need an approach that exploits their assumptions about our capabilities." Morrison watched Tom's transformation with professional interest. The quiet administrator was disappearing, replaced by someone who approached tactical problems with the confidence of extensive experience. Tom's analysis was rapid and comprehensive, identifying factors that less experienced planners might miss. "What do you recommend?" Morrison asked. Tom studied the geographical data for several minutes, mentally calculating distances, timing, and resource requirements. His plan would need to account for multiple variables while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. Most importantly, it would need to succeed without compromising the safety of personnel who were depending on his expertise. "We need to create multiple distractions that force the criminal organization to divide their attention," Tom said, beginning to outline his tactical approach. "If we can make them respond to threats in different locations simultaneously, we can create windows of opportunity for extraction that wouldn't exist under normal circumstances." Morrison leaned forward, recognizing the sophistication of Tom's strategic thinking. "What kind of distractions?" Tom pulled up mapping software and began marking locations with practiced efficiency. Coordinated law enforcement raids on subsidiary operations, media attention focused on their criminal activities, and apparent escape attempts in different directions. Each diversion needs to be credible enough to demand their attention while being safe enough to avoid unnecessary casualties. The plan that Tom developed over the next hour was elegant in its complexity and comprehensive in its attention to detail. He coordinated with local law enforcement through diplomatic channels, arranged for media coverage that would pressure the criminal organization publicly, and developed multiple extraction routes that could be activated based on real-time intelligence about enemy movements. Reynolds arrived at Tom's workstation as the operational plan neared completion, reviewing the tactical documents with obvious appreciation for their sophistication and thoroughness. The director's expression showed satisfaction that his test had produced exactly the kind of expertise that Blackwater needed for complex operations. "Outstanding work," Reynolds said, studying the coordinated timeline that Tom had developed. "This level of tactical planning demonstrates exactly why we need your capabilities in a formal operational role." Tom looked up from his computer screen, realizing that his cover was now completely blown beyond any possibility of recovery. His demonstration of tactical expertise had been too comprehensive and too professional to explain away through academic study or natural analytical ability. "The team's safety was the priority," Tom said simply. "Everything else is secondary to bringing them home safely." Reynolds nodded with understanding and respect, which is exactly the attitude we need from our operational planning staff. "Tom, you've just proven that your capabilities are essential for missions like this one. Keeping those capabilities hidden serves no one's interests." The extraction operation unfolded over the next 8 hours with precision that impressed even the experienced personnel who coordinated it from Blackwater's operations center. Tom's tactical plan worked exactly as designed, creating enough confusion and misdirection to allow the field team to reach a secure extraction point without detection or confrontation. Sarah Washington witnessed Tom's coordination of the operation with growing amazement and confusion. The quiet colleague she had known for months was demonstrating knowledge and expertise that seemed impossible for someone with his official background. His communication with field assets was professional and authoritative. His understanding of tactical procedures was comprehensive, and his emotional investment in the outcome was deeply personal. "Tom, how do you know so much about this kind of operation?" Sarah asked during a brief pause in the communication flow. Tom met her eyes directly for the first time since he had begun working at Blackwater. "Because I've been in situations like this before, Sarah, more times than I wanted to count." The honest admission carried weight that went far beyond his words. Sarah could see years of experience and responsibility in Tom's expression, understanding suddenly that her assumptions about his background had been completely incorrect. "Military?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Tom replied simply. "Special operations. The kind that officially don't happen and can't be discussed even years later." Sarah absorbed this revelation with the shock of someone discovering that a familiar landscape contained hidden depths and dangers. "Why didn't you tell us? Why hide something like that?" Tom's expression softened as he recognized the genuine confusion and perhaps hurt in Sarah's voice. "Because I wanted to be normal. I wanted to be someone who fixed supply problems and coordinated schedules instead of someone who planned operations where mistakes cost lives." The explanation helped Sarah understand Tom's behavior during the months they had worked together. His careful distance, his reluctance to discuss his background, and his competence that had occasionally seemed excessive for his role all made sense when viewed through the lens of his military experience. "Does this mean you'll be leaving us?" Sarah asked with obvious concern. Tom considered her question carefully. Reynolds's proposal would mean transitioning to assignments that utilized his tactical expertise while maintaining some connection to the administrative team that had provided him with stability and friendship during his civilian transition. "I don't know yet," Tom admitted. "But if I do take on different responsibilities, I hope we can remain friends. Your friendship has meant more to me than you probably realize." The field team's successful extraction was confirmed at 11:30 p.m. With all personnel safely recovered and no casualties sustained during the operation, Tom's tactical plan had achieved complete success, while maintaining the operational security that protected both Blackwater's personnel and the local assets who had provided support. Reynolds approached Tom's workstation as the operations center began returning to normal activity levels. "Tom, I think it's time we formalized your role here. You've demonstrated capabilities that are too valuable to waste on administrative tasks." Tom looked around the operations center, seeing colleagues who now knew at least part of the truth about his background. His secret was revealed, his cover was permanently compromised, and his future at Blackwater would need to acknowledge the expertise he had tried to hide. "What exactly are you proposing?" Tom asked. Reynolds pulled out the employment contract that he had shown Tom earlier, along with additional documents that detailed the specific assignments and protections that would govern his new role. Senior Tactical Consultant with Compartmentalized Security Protocols. You would work on operational planning and training development while maintaining appropriate boundaries around your classified background. Tom studied the contract language, recognizing legal protections that had been designed to accommodate personnel in his situation. The arrangement would allow him to contribute meaningfully while preserving the anonymity that protected both him and other former Eagles Talent operatives. "What about my administrative duties?" Tom asked, gesturing toward the supply requests and coordination tasks that had filled his days for months. Those responsibilities would be transitioned to other personnel, Reynolds replied. Your time would be focused on assignments that utilize your specialized expertise effectively. Tom realized that accepting the offer would mean permanently leaving behind the quiet anonymity that had provided him with peace during his transition to civilian life. But the evening's operation had reminded him of the satisfaction that came from using his skills to protect people and complete important missions. Janet Chun approached their conversation with obvious curiosity about Tom's changing role at Blackwater. Tom, I understand that your responsibilities may be expanding beyond administrative coordination. I want you to know that your work in our department has been exemplary and will miss your contributions. Tom appreciated Janet's professional support, recognizing that his transition would affect the entire administrative team that had unknowingly provided him with cover during his adjustment to civilian life. Thank you, Janet. Working with your team has been one of the most positive experiences of my civilian transition. As Tom signed the documents that would formalize his new role at Blackwater, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from the classified operations of Eagle's Talon to the administrative cubicles of a private military contractor, and finally to acknowledgement of his true capabilities. The faded eagle tattoo on his arm no longer seemed like a liability to be hidden, but rather a reminder of skills that could be used to protect people and serve purposes larger than his personal comfort. The quiet administrator named Tom Bradley would continue to exist, but he would now be supported by formal recognition of the expertise that had made him valuable to colleagues who had become friends and an organization that had provided him with purpose during his transition to civilian life. His past was no longer a secret to be guarded, but rather a foundation for contributions that could make a difference in situations where lives depended on tactical excellence and operational expertise. 6 months later, Tom Bradley stood in Blackwater's briefing room, addressing a group of young operatives preparing for their first overseas deployment. The faded eagle tattoo was visible on his forearm as he pointed to tactical maps, no longer hidden but worn with quiet pride. His transition from invisible administrator to respected tactical consultant had been seamless, earning him the trust of colleagues who valued his expertise over his mysterious past. Sarah Washington, now promoted to Senior Administrative Coordinator, often visited his new office with updates from the department that had unknowingly sheltered him during his civilian transition. Their friendship had deepened through honesty, proving that authentic relationships could survive the revelation of hidden truths. The key to successful operations, Tom told his trainees, isn't having the most advanced equipment or the largest team. It's understanding that every person matters, every detail counts, and every mission is ultimately about bringing people home safely. One young operative raised his hand. Sir, how do we balance operational security with building trust within our teams? Tom smiled, thinking of Morrison Reynolds and the colleagues who had chosen to see his capabilities as assets rather than threats. Trust is earned through competence and character. When people know you'll protect what matters most to them, they'll trust you with everything else. As the briefing concluded, Tom returned to his office where new mission folders awaited his analysis. The work was challenging and meaningful, utilizing skills he had thought were buried forever, while providing the stability and purpose he had sought in civilian life. Sometimes the most dangerous people in the world truly are the ones who look like they couldn't hurt a fly. But sometimes, those same people become the guardians who ensure others never have to learn just how dangerous the world can be. What did you think of Tom's incredible transformation? Have you ever encountered someone whose true capabilities surprised you completely? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of hidden heroes and unexpected revelations.